I'm a little late with this one. The 4070's been out for a little while now, but things are interesting. There have been some new developments. It's a good thing that I'm actually late. You're going to want to watch this. This is actually the least bad 4000 series GPU that NVIDIA has launched. In a parallel universe, I might even say it's actually pretty good. So first we had the 4090, a fire-breathing monster with a price tag to boot. It's a very commanding price tag. If I'm being honest, the price is a little intimidating, makes me a little uncomfortable. It's not the most amazing price in the world. And then there was the 4080 and the 4070 Ti, and now we have the 4070, which actually, I think the Founders Edition box is probably one of the most impressive boxes that there is. This is a better box than the 4090. And look, it's a true 2-slot card. Although this is the cheapest feeling 4070 to hold in the hands that I've had my hands on. I mean, it doesn't feel, I don't know. Maybe I've gotten used to the giant 3.5 slot cards. I don't know, it just feels really tiny. It's actually surprisingly capable though. It's pretty good, but we'll talk about performance in a moment. It's sort of a weird situation. Look, there's a secret compartment with the cables. You know, if we could forego the box and just give me a bag and maybe give me an extra 2 gigabytes of VRAM for that cost offset, I'd take it. This thing has 12 gigabytes of VRAM. The GPU on this is the 8104, that's the internal code name, that's the Ada Lovelace, and it is developed on a TSMC 5 nanometer process. Originally launched April 13th, 2023, with an MSRP of $599, at least that's what our Founders Edition version of the card is. It is a PCI Express 4.0 by 16 interface, which is pretty good. It's a base clock of 1920 megahertz and a boost clock of 2.475 gigahertz. Memory clock is 1313 megahertz. It's about 21 gigabit effective, or just shy of half a terabyte per second, 500 gigabytes per second, give or take. It has 12 gigs of GDDR6X, 192 bits wide. It has 5,888 shading units, 184 TMUs, 64 ROPs, 46 SM, 184 tensor cores, 46 RT cores, and has L1 and L2 cache. In fact, 36 megabytes of L2 cache. And the L2 cache is how this card does its magic trick. It's really interesting. This is a card that has overall very good 1080p and 1440p performance, but non-linear scaling to 4K. That's a fancy way of saying it don't do so good in 4K. Sorry. Part of the reason for that, I think, is the L2 geometry and the memory bandwidth. NVIDIA went so far as, retailers were just listing out GPU specs, and it leaked pretty early on that the memory bandwidth was only about 500 gigabytes per second, which before the 4070 may have been a red flag, because you would look at that and you would say, well, the memory bandwidth on this card isn't sufficiently high that it's really going to perform that much different than prior generations. So I would say that if you were tracking these kind of things very closely before it was released, your expectations were quite low. It's like, oh, the pricing is going to be too high. That may still be true. And the performance is probably not going to be there. That was not actually true, which we'll dive into the performance benchmarks in a minute, but I'm sort of setting this up. But that also left me with some questions sort of going into the review. I would say that maybe that sort of influenced me a little bit looking at this, looking at the 4070 performance and looking at the 4070 Ti versus 4080. The 4070 Ti was originally going to launch as a 4080, but it has vastly different performance than the actual 4080. And then the 4090 is vastly head and shoulders above what we get into with any other performance, which is sort of weird. Well, I mean, it's not atypical, but things are sort of weird macroeconomically. GPU prices were out of control because of cryptocurrency, and so we're coming out of that, and so it's no longer the case that your gamer is competing with a cryptocurrency miner for compute resources and buying a GPU, if that makes sense. So I don't know. And usually something in the 4060, 4070 class is what most people are buying. It doesn't help matters very much at all that there's nothing in the 7000 series from AMD yet that is really an answer for this price point at about $600 US. That also puts a lot of pressure on board partners, the $600 price point, because board partners are usually looking to make a version of this card that is a little bit more overclocked, is a little bit faster, has some other features to kind of entice you to maybe use their version of the card. But $600 for the Founders Edition version of the card, this version of the card, is already kind of pushing it. And you can definitely tell that NVIDIA had to do some things. I mean, this feels cheaper even than like the 3060, Founders Edition, which was not even really a thing. Like I say, maybe it's my imagination, or maybe it's just because I've gotten used to the giant cards that we have. I mean, the 4090 is a really substantial card. Most people will implement a dual 8-pin type design. This is a 300 watt card, so this would work with a 500, 550, 600 watt power supply, no problem. It's a pretty good choice for OEM systems. But I am a little disappointed. If we dig into Newegg and we look at the cards that are available on Newegg, there's really not very many 2-slot cards. We'll talk more about that in a second. In terms of physical interface, we have 3 DisplayPort 1.4 and 1 HDMI 2.1. No surprises there. You get the hot air exhaust from the rear. You get the fan design where heat pipes, heat sink. It's a pretty good design. It works, even though it feels less substantial than I'm used to with Founders Edition versions of the card. The cooling works. This one does have NVIDIA's, the 12 volt, the micro with the smaller pins. You're not going to have any problems with it. The adapter cable that's in here will go to 2 8-pin cables, but if you have a power supply, such as the one from FSP Group that we've reviewed previously, that has the built-in, NVIDIA style power connector, you can use that, and that's maybe a little easier from a cable management standpoint. But for fit and finish, this particular dual slot card would be my first choice for a small form factor build in this configuration if you're going to go with NVIDIA. So as I kind of alluded to, one of the things that I was really struggling with on this review is the 4070, I don't know. The 4090, the 4080, 4070 Ti, this is what we've seen so far. And when I look at the 4070, there's something off about the results, something that didn't really make sense to me, and it took me a long while to figure it out. The 4070 doesn't perform the way that I would expect it to based on a very long history with NVIDIA. 1080 to 2070, 2080 to 3070, 3080 to 4070. But wait a minute. When you move from the 3080 to the 4070, you actually go backwards about 3% in performance overall. What? That doesn't make sense. Let's dive in and look at a few benchmarks just so you get an idea of where we are. So if we start with the breakdown of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's not really going to give us anything meaningful because at 1080p, pretty much any card is going to be able to run at hundreds of frames per second at Shadow of the Tomb Raider. It's not really a big deal. At higher settings, we're looking at 241 FPS versus 253 FPS on our comparison. Radeon RX 6900 XT, the 6950 is at price parity. I have a 6900. Our OC formula from ASRock that we reviewed previously, as well as, the RTX 4090, which is kind of a flagship card. But this is kind of a first sign that something's a little weird. If we look at the performance of the 3080 with this comparison in mind, there's really not a lot of performance difference between the 4070 and the 3080. And in fact, the 4070 is just a little slower than the 3080 in most scenarios. It's within 1 to 3%, give or take. Borderlands also is a little bit of a surprising result. I mean, maybe my mental map of Borderlands is off today, but I was like, hey, doesn't Borderlands usually favor Team Green over Team Red? And yet, 211 FPS, and the Callisto Protocol 212 FPS, and our 1% lows and our 0.1% lows were better in both Borderlands 3 and the Callisto Protocol for 1080p. Now, the interesting thing with the 4070 is that the memory bandwidth and the cache layout really lend themselves more to 1080p gaming and 1440p gaming than 4K gaming. Leave it to NVIDIA. They'll figure out a way to give you a card that can do better 1440p, but not quite as good 4K, so that you have a path upward. And the more I looked at this, the more I realized, wait a minute, the 4070 Ti is really where the 4070 should be. Now, hear me out. We're going to go off on a tangent here for a second. If you had bought a 1080 and you were considering an upgrade, the 2070, and you look at the 2070, it's like the 2070 is 16 to 22% better than a 1080. Depends on the game, depends on some other parameters, but better. If you look at the 2080 and you look at the 3070 is better. But this is kind of a weird situation where the 4070 is not better than the 3080. This is kind of a weird situation. I hope this is not a portent of things to come. It really makes me start to question GPU upgrades in general. And maybe this is AMD's strategy overall, because the 4070 launched, and for 4070 launch day reviews, it's like, okay, it's $600. It's not the ripoff that the 4080 was and continues to be. I still don't think the 4080 is a good value. The 4090 card is a flagship card, and that's also a change this generation. You know, the Titan, when the Titan was a flagship card, it was hundreds of dollars more and only a little bit better for gaming performance. Now, it unlocked a whole bunch of other stuff. That was cool. But gaming performance, you know, buy it if you're an enthusiast, but you're not really leaving anything on the table if you're a gamer, and it was hundreds of dollars cheaper to get not a Titan. But now, if you want the very best thing, you're going to have to shell out for a 4090. Sort of, NVIDIA took the wrong lesson from that, I think, which was, oh, people are willing to pay a lot of money for a Titan. Let's give them less and charge them the same, because they'll continue to pay it. It's like, ooh. Same thing is happening here with the 4070, I think. Gen on gen, for all prior generations, you would see pretty significant performance uplift. But when we break down the performance, even best case scenario at 1080p, knowing that 4K is going to be worse because of our aforementioned memory architecture and our L2 cache situation, it still doesn't look good. The 3080 generally, I mean, overall, if we average the games that I play and the games that we go through the benchmark, the 3080 is about 1.5 to 2% better than the 4070 Founders Edition. And I start to think, it's like, what card would actually slot in where I would expect the 4070 to slot in? And that's the 4070 Ti. But the 4070 Ti costs way too much for what it is. Gen on gen, I don't care about the inflation. I don't care about the macroeconomic conditions. I don't care about all of those things. It seems like it's too much of an increase generation over generation. I mean, like I mentioned before, it's like, this is a Founders Edition version of the card. It's a 2-slot card. It's going to be smaller. Maybe I've just gotten used to the feeling of giant GPUs, but this doesn't feel like an NVIDIA Founders GPU. I mean, usually NVIDIA Founders GPUs are really brick-like. This one's okay, but it's not. It feels a little, I don't know. Just doesn't feel quite as high-end in the hand. Anyway, back to the performance. Now, for games like Borderlands 3, the scaling is not unreasonable. From 1080p at 157 FPS to 112 FPS at 1440 to 60 FPS at 2160. It could be a little better, but, you know, we go from 112 to 60 versus 155 to 84. It's halving. The performance halves from the 6900 XT, and it halves from the 4070. The 6900 XT is better performance across the board, and you can expect a 6950 to be even that much better. 6950, you know, is a juiced 6900, so it's not going to be dramatically better, but it's going to be a little better. This is sort of your worst case scenario if you're comparing. Or if you're doing comparison shopping, it's like, well, you know, I could get that 6900 and have quite a bit better performance overall, or even maybe a 6800 and have it cost less. But one of the advantages of releasing this review just a few days later is like, oh, look, the pricing has adjusted a little bit more on 6900s from AMD, and they're basically at price parity. Which would you rather have, 12 gigs of VRAM in the 4070 or gobs and gobs and gobs of VRAM with the 6900, plus also better performance, plus also all the other features? And it's like, NVIDIA's got a little bit of a challenge on their hands. Overall, the performance of the 4070 is pretty good, especially at 1080p and even given 1440p. But the performance fall off at 4K for other higher end games like Cyberpunk 2077 is a little excessive. This is not a 4K card. It's not linear scaling either, like we saw with Borderlands 3. What you might be able to run at, you know, 70 or 80 FPS at 1440 with higher graphics fidelity settings in a game, you might not even be able to get 40 or 35 FPS at 4K. It's not a linear fall off. I mean, 1080p is 1/4 the number of pixels of 4K. In an ideal world, if you saw 1/4 the performance, okay, yeah, maybe there's something to that. But that's not really what's happening with the way that performance scales on the 4070. And it makes sense given the cache and memory bandwidth architecture that we see in the 4070. Like, it makes sense to me. I can look at that without really diving into the details of that. Like, that's not a complaint against the card. This is a very good 1440p card. Also, widescreen. I'll mention widescreen. I didn't include the benchmarks for widescreen, but 3440 by 1440 is also pretty good with this card, and that is a little more challenging of a resolution than you might expect in some scenarios, depending on the game and the engine and everything else. Game like Borderlands, doesn't matter. It's so old, it's fine. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's so old, doesn't matter. It's fine. 12 gigs of VRAM here also does kind of help it with higher resolution texture games, and we're moving into sort of the post 8 gigabyte world. 8 gigabytes on this card would have been completely untenable. Fortunately, NVIDIA did choose to put 12 gigabytes of VRAM on it, so no complaints there. Good job. And the last thing that I really like about this card is that it's 2-slot, at least the Founders Edition version is. Checking Newegg really quick, PNY, Zotac, Gigabyte, they've got 2-slot versions of this card on Newegg, but basically nobody else. Pretty much everybody is just slapping their old 3-slot cooler, which is kind of overkill, on this card and calling it a day. I think they expect it to be DOA, but it seems like it's actually selling really well. Again, because my review's a little bit late here, I can sort of look at this and do that. In this crazy world of, you know, the $2,000 street price on the 4090, maybe $600 seems like a good deal. And $600 is a good deal for a GPU like the 6900 or the 6950, because they launched it at $1,000 not that long ago. It's a good price at $1,000 in that performance context. Gaming performance is really good. But given the history, like a 2070 versus a 1080, 2080 versus a 3070 and 4080 something versus a 3070, a little sketchier there. The 4070 really should not be at performance parity with a 3080, which is kind of what the takeaway is. Actually, the 3080 is the more desirable card, even with less VRAM at 4K, which is frustrating to try to put that together in a review in a succinct way that makes sense that I can show you with game results. I honestly, for 1440p, I honestly don't know if I would prefer to have a 3080 or a 4070, because the 4070's got more VRAM, but the 3080 is a little faster. But it's crazy that the 3080 is a little faster, given the history of 1080 versus 2070. You know, I don't know. It's hard to... It wasn't something that I could really articulate until I had to sit down and think about it, and I had time. And I thought it was interesting, and I thought I would share, because not a lot of other people have really pointed that out. And again, the 4070 Ti kind of fits here where you would expect the regular 4070 to work, given the historical cadence. So I don't know what to make of that. When AMD's 7000 series answer to the 4070 launches, there's probably going to be even more pressure on NVIDIA to do pricing adjustments. And if we see NVIDIA make these kinds of compromises in the Founders Edition version of the card, and we look at the pricing of non-Founders Edition versions of the 4070 on Newegg, it seems like NVIDIA and their partners are already under a significant squeeze here. I don't know if that means overall GPU hardware quality is suffering and they're hoping to make that up with software, things like frame generation technologies. That is going to be the temptation. That's going to be the business pressures. Like, well, if we really lean into our frame generation technology, we can sell less hardware. That's ultimately not great for gamers. Frame generation in terms of building a better gaming experience on better hardware, okay, yeah, that's good. But software is a lower cost proposition than hardware, generally. But you dig into it, and the R&D cost of software is also kind of high. So your software is all your sunk costs, and then your cost of reproduction is zero, whereas a GPU requires the R&D cost plus the ongoing manufacturing cost. And a lot of modern GPU design depends on TSMC 5 nanometers. So it kind of makes sense that we're entering a difficult period here, but I don't know if $600 is the sweet spot for this kind of performance. You could get a lower tier GPU that's less expensive, something in the $400 to $500 range, because it's going to be about 90% of the performance. And like I say, this launch is weird, because historically I think you could expect intuitively the 4070 to perform better than it is. You would expect the 4070 to perform more like the 4070 Ti based on the historical pattern of when you get an upgrade. And maybe gamers could live with the fact that the 4K performance is a little worse owing to the architectural changes if the performance uplift to the 4070 from 3000 series cards was there. But it's not. The 4070 is not better than the 3080, and in a lot of ways it's a little bit worse. So that's new. That's new precedent. I don't know that I care for that. But overall, and taken in a vacuum, the card performs well at 1080p and 1440p. If you have a phantom gaming monitor like this one that's high refresh rate, or the ultra wide, you're gonna have a good gaming experience, and you're gonna get Team Green, and you're gonna do it in 2 slots with 2 8-pin power connectors, and it's not gonna run super hot, and there's a lot to like there. It's really just the price and the first data point on this trajectory. It's troubling. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forum.